The morning it happened didn't feel like the start of a story. It felt like the end of one. Cincinnati woke slowly, wrapped in a cold December stillness, as if the entire city sensed something was coming. A kind of quiet that sits on the windows, the sidewalks, the breath of every person stepping out of their house. The kind of quiet that precedes a storm, not in the sky, but in the soul. Inside the Carter home on Maple Street, sunlight streamed weakly through the kitchen window, landing on the polished wooden table where Helen Carter, just 22, sat frozen like a statue. A half-finished cup of coffee stood untouched in front of her. The steam had long vanished. Her mother moved around the kitchen, humming Sinatra under her breath, doing everything she could to create an illusion of normalcy. But even the humming sounded forced, fragile, like it could shatter if anyone breathed too hard. Because on the counter, next to the salt and pepper shakers, lay the thing none of them wanted to look at. A yellow envelope, folded, unopened, but already screaming. Western Union. Everyone in America feared that logo. A knock had come 15 minutes earlier, sharp, quick, official. Helen had opened the door expecting the paperboy, maybe a neighbor. Instead, she saw the Western Union courier standing stiffly, cap low, eyes apologetic. "This is for the Whitman family," he said. Next door. Their neighbors. Their friends. Mrs. Whitman opened the envelope on her porch. Helen saw the moment everything in the woman's world collapsed. Her scream tore through Maple Street like a blade. "No! God, please no! Not my boy! Not my Tom!" She fell to the ground. Her husband rushed out, catching her as she broke. And Helen, standing 3 feet away, felt something inside her chest snap like a bone. She walked back home shaking, the scream still ringing in her ears. Her mother tried to comfort her. Her father tried to explain it as part of war. But Helen didn't hear them, because the scream had attached itself to her heart, dragging her into a truth she could no longer escape. This war wasn't thousands of miles away. It had arrived at their doorstep. Her younger brother Danny, 18, had enlisted 2 months earlier. He was training in Texas, writing letters home full of hope and jokes. But a boy full of hope wasn't immune to bullets. And telegrams didn't care whose home they shattered. Helen looked out the window at the Whitmans' porch, now crowded with neighbors holding a grieving mother. And something inside her shifted, suddenly, sharply, permanently. She felt it like a door slamming shut, a moment that divides life into a before and an after. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and whispered, almost too quietly for even herself to hear, I can't just sit here." Her father turned. "What was that?" "I can't just sit here," Helen said louder this time, her voice cracking but fierce. "I can't stay in a kitchen while boys my brother's age are dying alone on foreign soil." Her mother stepped forward. "Helen, you can't think like that. There are ways to help from here." "No." Helen's voice trembled. "There aren't. Not enough. Not anymore." Her father sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You've talked about the Red Cross before, but—" "I'm joining them." She didn't let him finish. "I'm joining the Red Cross today." Her mother froze. Her father stared at her as if she'd said she was leaving for the moon. "You'll be near the front lines," he warned. "You'll be near danger. Do you understand that?" "I understand that Mrs. Whitman will never see her son again," Helen replied. "And I understand that there are boys out there, scared, alone, hurt, who need someone to bring them a cup of coffee, a blanket, a warm voice, a letter from home." The mention of letters made her father's jaw tighten. Everyone knew letters were a lifeline. Everyone knew how many never arrived. Mail trucks destroyed, routes cut off, families waiting for words that never came. "No one is delivering hope anymore," Helen said softly. "I want to." Her father exhaled slowly, heavily. "Helen, this war is taking enough from us already. Don't let it take you, too." But Helen's decision had already rooted itself deep inside her. Something unstoppable. something that felt less like bravery and more like duty. Not to her country, not even to the Red Cross, but to every mother who deserved to know her son was thinking of her before he died. To every soldier writing home with tears on the page. To her brother, who might one day need someone like her. That afternoon, while her mother cried quietly at the kitchen sink, Helen packed a small suitcase. 2 dresses, a sweater, her father's old pocket Bible, a photo of her family at Coney Island, her brother's last letter, and courage she didn't yet know she had. By sunset, she had bought a bus ticket to the Red Cross Recruitment Center in Indianapolis. Before leaving, she stood in front of the Whitman house. A gold star now hung in the window, a symbol of sacrifice, a symbol she prayed would never appear in her own home. Helen whispered a promise to the star, to the porch, to the people inside still grieving. I won't be a witness. I will be a helper. When the bus pulled up, its brakes screeching in the cold evening air, Helen took a breath so deep it felt like her lungs were trying to learn how to be brave. She stepped on. The door closed behind her. And without knowing it, she had started a journey that would make her one of the most fearless women of the war. A woman who would cross enemy lines, confront death, smuggle hundreds of final messages, and become the last lifeline for soldiers taking their final breaths. She wasn't a soldier, but she was about to become something far more dangerous. A woman carrying the last words of the dying.
The bus ride to Indianapolis felt like a blur. Faces passing, scenery shifting, the steady clatter of wheels filling the silence Helen carried inside her. But boarding the ship to Europe, that was the moment her world truly tilted. It was early morning. The sky was bruised with clouds, wind clawing at her Red Cross-issued overcoat as she joined the long line of volunteers boarded onto the massive transport ship. It towered above the dock like a steel giant, gray, scarred, and utterly indifferent to the lives it carried. Helen held her suitcase close, her breath catching as military policemen barked orders, directing people onto the gangway. Many of the volunteers were women like her, young, hopeful, terrified but pretending not to be. Some wore carefully done hair and bright lipstick that looked absurdly brave against the cold wind. Others clutched rosaries, small Bibles, or folded letters from home. One girl, maybe 18, whispered to her friend, "My mama still thinks I'm going to New York for secretarial training." They both laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that hides fear. Helen didn't laugh. She couldn't. She felt her stomach twisting with every step she took toward the ship. She was crossing an ocean, straight into a war. The dock bell rang, echoing across the freezing water. "All volunteers, move forward!" Helen stepped onto the gangway. Below her, the Atlantic waves slapped against the hull, dark and restless, as if warning her, this is no longer Cincinnati. Inside the ship, the air was thick with diesel, wet rope, sweat, and something else, anticipation, sharp and electric, the kind that keeps people awake even when they're exhausted. Rows of bunks lined the walls, close together, almost claustrophobic. Helen found her assigned bunk, middle row, number 42. The mattress was thin, the pillow lumpy, but she set her suitcase down carefully. There, on the lower bunk, a girl with auburn curls looked up. "You knew?" "Yeah," Helen smiled politely. "First deployment." The girl grinned. "Me too. I'm Margaret. They say London's rough, but at least the boys are cute." Helen tried to smile, but her eyes drifted to the porthole. The world outside was changing. She could feel it. The ship leaves home. When the horn sounded, deep and mournful, Helen felt the vibration through her bones. The ship groaned as it pulled away from the dock. Families waved. Volunteers cried quietly, pressing their hands against the glass like they could still touch home. Helen watched the American shoreline shrink, farther and farther, until it became nothing more than a faint shadow, a ghost. She swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. A Red Cross supervisor briefed them on rules. No lights after dark. No wandering alone. No entering restricted areas. Air raid drills happen twice a day.
Submarine alarms can happen any time. Submarine. The word alone chilled her. Everyone on that ship knew the ocean was crawling with German U-boats, silent killers waiting for a silhouette against the water. More than a dozen ships had been sunk that year. Helen didn't need reminding. She could feel danger pulsing beneath the waves. The night the ocean woke her. 3 nights into the journey, the ship was swallowed by darkness. True darkness, the kind untouched by city lights, full of mystery and menace. The volunteers lay in their bunks, trying to sleep, trying not to think. But sleep didn't come easily. Not when the ocean groaned like a living beast. Not when the ship creaked with every rise and fall of the waves. Helen lay awake, staring at the ceiling inches above her face, listening to Margaret breathe softly below. The room smelled of metal, damp clothes, and fear. Then, a siren, sharp, electric, violent. The volunteers jolted upright. A soldier burst through the door. "Submarine alert! Everyone to defense stations!" Helen's heart thundered. Her hands shook as she climbed out of her bunk, joining the stampede of terrified volunteers racing down the corridor. The lights flickered red. Boots pounded the metal floor. "Move! Move!" Helen clutched the railing as the ship swayed violently. She could hear it, the unmistakable thud of depth charges exploding in the water nearby. Each one felt like a giant's fist slamming into the ocean. The ship groaned under the force. People screamed. Someone cried out a prayer. Helen pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming fast. Is this how it ends? Before I even begin? Another explosion shook the ship so violently her knees buckled. Margaret grabbed her hand. "Just hold on. Don't let go." Minutes felt like hours. The explosions continued, then faded, faded, faded. Silence, terrifying silence. Then the all-clear bell rang. A soldier shouted from the hallway, "U-boat neutralized, stand down!" The room erupted with sobs, relief, shaky laughter, whispered prayers. Helen didn't speak. She just stared at her trembling hands. She had faced death for the first time, and death had blinked. But something changed inside her. If she had been unsure before, now she knew. She wasn't on this ship for adventure. She was on it because she was needed. London, the city that never slept. When the ship finally docked in England, the volunteers stepped down onto the battered London streets. Sirens wailed in the distance. Smoke stained the sky. Buildings stood with their roofs blown off, windows shattered, walls blackened by fire. The city felt like a wounded soldier trying to stay upright. Helen had seen photographs in newspapers, but nothing compared to the reality. Nothing compared to seeing people walk past craters as if they were potholes. Nothing compared to hearing bomb sirens so common that Londoners barely flinched. A British officer welcomed them with a tired smile. "Welcome to London. You'll get used to the noise." A bomb exploded far away. The ground shook slightly. Helen didn't react, not because she was brave, but because she was in shock. Margaret whispered, "God, what have we walked into?" Helen didn't answer, because deep inside her chest, beneath the fear, beneath the trembling, beneath the overwhelming sight of a world on fire, she felt something growing. Purpose, a strange, fierce kind of courage she couldn't explain. A voice whispering, "You crossed the ocean for a reason, and the reason is coming." She didn't know yet that within weeks she would break the rules, defy the command, cross forbidden roads, and carry the most dangerous thing a woman could carry in a war zone, the words of dying soldiers. But the path had begun, and once begun, Helen Carter was unstoppable. The rain in southern England didn't fall, it stabbed. Sharp, Sideways, metallic drops hammering the Red Cross tent canvas like angry fingers. Inside, Helen Carter stood over a wooden crate marked Undeliverable, Destroy. She stared at the stamp again. Destroy. The word punched her in the stomach each time she saw it. Around her, typewriters clacked like tiny guns. Volunteers scrambled with supply lists, medical kits, hot coffee runs. But Helen heard nothing. Her world narrowed down to that crate. She slid her fingers under the lid, hesitating. She already knew what she would find. She had seen 3 crates like this today alone. She opened it. Inside, hundreds of envelopes. Rain-warped, blood-stained, ash-smudged, some torn at the edges, some crushed. But all of them carried the same thing. The last words of American boys who would never go home. Letters from Normandy. From hedgerows, from field hospitals, from foxholes where they bled out before medics could reach them. Every envelope was a heartbeat that had stopped somewhere in France. Helen picked one up gently, as if it were alive. The handwriting was shaky, young, hurried. To Mom, if this is the last letter I ever send. And that was it. The page was torn there, smeared in brown, not ink. Her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. The truth they never told volunteers. A voice behind her said, "They're routing everything through censorship now. Nothing gets out unless command approves." Helen turned. A tall Army postal officer, Captain Raymond Hill, watched her. He crossed his arms and lowered his voice. "Some of these boys wrote things headquarters doesn't want sent home. Fear, pain, criticism, the truth." He paused. "And others just get lost in the chaos." Helen held up the torn letter. "This is his mother, Captain." He sighed. "Orders are orders." "And you just burn them?" Her voice cracked. "We don't have the manpower to deliver personal mail through front lines, Miss Carter. It's impossible." Helen stared back down into the crate. 100 voices begging not to be forgotten. She didn't look up when she said, "Impossible isn't a reason. It's an excuse." The moment that changed everything. That night, the tent lights flickered as the wind hammered the canvas. Volunteers slept on cots. Engines hummed outside. The smell of diesel and wet wool hung in the air. Helen sat at her small desk, her kerosene lamp glowing faintly. She pulled one letter after another from the crate, reading only the names on the envelopes. Tom Jensen, Iowa. Michael Grant, California. Ben Turner, Ohio. Samuel Sammy Lopez, Arizona. Each name felt heavier than the last. Somewhere in America, these families were waiting, checking their mailboxes, praying. Helen whispered, "Not on my watch. Not one more family waits for a letter that never comes." She carefully packed 37 letters into her Red Cross satchel, pressed them flat beneath her medical supplies. No one saw her do it. No one needed to. She knew what she was becoming, a smuggler. Not of weapons, not of intelligence, but of truth. Her first run, silence, mud, and fear. 3 days later, she boarded an Army transport truck heading toward newly secured French territory. She wasn't supposed to be on it. Red Cross volunteers stayed behind lines, but Helen had quietly traded places with another girl who had a fever. The truck bounced violently on broken roads. Mud splashed onto the canvas cover. Men inside tried to sleep with helmets over their eyes. Helen sat stiff, clutching her bag. Every bump felt like a heartbeat, every jolt a warning. She watched the countryside roll past, farms burned to the ground, trees shredded by artillery, craters everywhere. Nothing alive, nothing whole. A young soldier across from her noticed her shaking hands. "Nervous?" he asked kindly. She forced a small smile. "First time this close to the fighting." He nodded. "Don't worry, they usually fire past us." Usually. The boy was maybe 19. He deserved so much better than this. Helen touched her bag again. Inside were 37 families depending on her. Depending on her breaking rules. Depending on her surviving. The first checkpoint, where it could have ended. As the truck approached a makeshift American checkpoint, soldiers flagged them down. "Mail inspection," one MP shouted. Helen froze. Mail, inspection, her bag. A second MP climbed into the back of the truck. "Everyone, open your bags. Orders from HQ." Her pulse spiked so fast she felt dizzy. The young soldier beside her leaned over. "Relax," he whispered. "They don't give Red Cross girls trouble." "Not this time," she prayed. "Please, not this time." The MP moved down the line, checking packs. 5 soldiers, 4 volunteers, 2 medics. Then he reached her. "Ma'am, your bag." Her throat felt glued shut. Hands trembling, she opened it just enough to show the top layer of bandages and morphine kits. He reached in. Her heart stopped. His fingers brushed the envelopes, then moved to the side pocket instead. He pulled out a small tin of aspirin. "That all?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." He tossed the tin back. "Move along." The truck roared forward. Helen didn't breathe for 10 seconds straight. Her eyes stung. If he had reached 1 inch lower, she would have been removed, questioned, possibly detained. Not for carrying weapons, for carrying hope. 2 weeks later, after hopping supply trucks, medical jeeps, and a mail convoy, she finally reached a field post building where letters were sorted for shipment back to the U.S. Helen walked straight to the head clerk, a gruff sergeant with ink-stained hands. She placed a single envelope on the table. He looked at the name. His jaw clenched. "I knew this kid," he whispered. "Good boy. He died trying to drag his squad mate to cover." Helen swallowed hard. His mother deserves this. The sergeant rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrist. "No rule says I can't put this one in the special courier pouch," he finally said. He stamped it. Hard. Helen exhaled shakily. 1 letter saved. 1 family spared the agony of silence. But 36 more remained in her bag, and hundreds more in the crates back in England. She walked outside the building and looked up at the gray sky. Her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not stopping." Word spread quietly among Red Cross volunteers. "If you have letters that got lost, give them to Helen. She'll get them through. She doesn't say how, but she does." Soldiers started approaching her too, sometimes shyly, sometimes desperate. "Miss, please, if anything happens to me, can you make sure this gets home?" Helen never said no, not once. She kept every promise, and each promise made her more of a target. Because soon, German patrols began hearing rumors too. Rumors of the American woman carrying secret messages across battle zones. They didn't know she wasn't a spy. They didn't care. And they were now hunting her. The sun barely rose over the shattered French countryside, and Helen Carter was already moving. The mud clung to her boots, sucking at every step, as though the earth itself wanted to slow her down. She gripped her satchel tightly, the weight of 35 letters pressing against her chest. Each one was a story, a heartbeat, a life ending somewhere far from home, and all of them depended on her to survive this morning. The roads were quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that hides ambushes and danger. Helen had memorized every possible route, avoided patrol schedules, and studied maps she wasn't supposed to have. Her uniform, still crisp from the night's drying, did little to hide her nerves. Every shadow between the trees felt alive, every rustle of leaves a warning. She kept her eyes low, scanning for movement. A single soldier might have been enough to ruin everything. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it would echo across the fields. The truck that usually delivered supplies was late. That was good, less eyes on her, but it also left her exposed, alone, vulnerable. The first checkpoint loomed ahead, an improvised barrier of sandbags and barbed wire. Helen slowed, steadying her breath. Soldiers in olive drab moved casually, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes scanning the horizon, but she knew they could stop her at any moment. She approached as if she belonged, shoulders squared, eyes forward. One of them raised a hand. ID. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she handed over her forged Red Cross pass. The soldier scrutinized it for a moment, then waved her through. She exhaled silently, forcing herself not to stumble. One checkpoint down, dozens more miles to go. The road stretched ahead, a winding line of mud and shattered trees, the remnants of bomb craters hidden beneath puddles. Helen's legs ached, her lungs burned, but she pressed forward. She had memorized each turn, each ditch, each tree stump that could serve as cover. Every letter in her satchel was a promise, every promise a responsibility she couldn't afford to break. A sudden noise made her freeze. Leaves crackling underfoot, a snapped branch in the distance. She pressed herself against the side of a ruined barn, heart hammering, listening. Shadows shifted. 2 figures emerged, German soldiers, patrolling, not part of her plan. Helen's breath caught. The letters, the bag. Everything depended on her moving perfectly now. She held her satchel against her body, making herself as small as possible. One soldier glanced in her direction. She remained still, eyes averted. Her body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't risk it. Movement would draw attention. The soldiers moved on, grumbling, leaving her trembling but alive. She exhaled slowly, pressed her forehead against the rough wall, and let herself feel the weight of what she was doing. Each run was more dangerous than the last. Every step could be the one that ended her journey, the one that ended the lives of all those who depended on her letters. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, turning the fog into a low-hanging haze. Helen followed the map in her mind, navigating by landmarks that might not exist tomorrow. Bombed-out walls, splintered barns, fallen fences, they all became guides. She moved silently, a ghost in a land that had become a battlefield. At midday, she reached a small village. Soldiers had abandoned it 2 days prior. Smoke still curled from chimneys, a bitter smell of burned wood lingering in the air. She paused, scanning for civilians. There were none, only debris and silence. Perfect. Helen set down her satchel, knees trembling from exhaustion. She opened it carefully, retrieving the first letter. The handwriting was messy, hurried. One of the boys must have written it with shaking hands, perhaps knowing it might be the last. She traced the ink with her fingertip, imagining the mother somewhere in Iowa, waiting for this very moment, unaware that a young woman had risked everything to deliver it. She continued, letter after letter, memorizing the names and places. Each one was a human life that needed acknowledgement, a story that deserved to reach home. It was dangerous, exhausting work, but Helen felt alive in a way she never had in Cincinnati, even among her family. Here, she mattered. Here, her actions were the difference between despair and hope. She packed the letters again, carefully, and continued moving. The village cleared. The next leg of the road opened but riddled with danger. Shell craters, barbed wire, remnants of skirmishes, each one a reminder of what could have ended her life at any moment. As the afternoon wore on, the sun dipped low, shadows stretching, and Helen stumbled upon a small patrol of Allied soldiers resting. They were tired, bloody, some injured. She stepped forward, unsure if she could ask for guidance, but then realized it didn't matter. She had the letters. That was her duty. She couldn't stop for comfort or assistance. Every moment she lingered increased risk. Hours later, her hands raw, her shoulders aching from the weight of the bag, she reached a small drop-off point. A friendly sergeant, briefed by whispers from other volunteers, met her. Helen handed over the letters. One by one, he checked them, nodded, and accepted them. Helen exhaled, her knees nearly buckling. The momentary relief was profound, but she knew it wouldn't last. Another crate awaited her back in England. Another shipment would need smuggling tomorrow, and another. Every day brought the same risk, the terror, the same chance to fail. Yet as she stood there in the dying light, watching the sergeant carry the letters into safe hands, Helen allowed herself a brief smile. She had made it. She had kept her promise for 35 lives today. That was enough to keep going for tomorrow. The road back was darker, colder, lonelier. The danger increased with each passing hour, and Helen knew she would not be able to relax until the letters reached their destinations. Her journey had just begun, but already she had become someone invisible, someone critical, someone unstoppable. And deep inside, beneath exhaustion, fear, and mud, Helen felt a fire ignite. One that would carry her across continents, past checkpoints, through enemy lines, and into history. She wasn't just delivering letters anymore. She was delivering hope, defying rules, risking everything, and showing the world that courage didn't always carry a rifle. By the time Helen collapsed into the back of a supply truck for the journey home, night had fallen. The sky was black, pierced by distant flares, the echo of artillery like a distant drum. She closed her eyes, clutching the bag. Every letter inside represented someone's heartbeat, and she had promised them all she would keep it safe. For the first time, she whispered to herself, a vow that would define her every move in the months to come. I will not fail. Not one, not ever. Helen Carter's next run began before dawn. The frost had hardened into a thin, crackling layer over the roads, and each step she took made a crunching sound that seemed far too loud in the quiet. Her satchel pressed against her chest, heavy with letters, each one more urgent than the last. Every mile, every footstep, every heartbeat carried the possibility of discovery, of death, of failure. She moved through the abandoned countryside, broken trees casting jagged shadows in the gray light. The villages she passed were silent, stripped bare by weeks of bombardment. Shells littering the streets like the remnants of forgotten battles. The air was thick with smoke, ash, and a coppery tang that made her stomach twist. This wasn't just war. It was a landscape of despair, and Helen was threading herself through its veins, invisible but exposed. Her first obstacle came in the form of a German patrol. The soldiers were alert, moving methodically, scanning for anything out of place. Helen pressed herself against the side of a crumbling wall, her breath caught in her throat. She could see the glint of rifles as they caught the faint light of the morning. Every instinct told her to run, but she knew one misstep could end everything. The letters, the lives depending on her, and perhaps her own. She crouched low, the satchel pressed to her stomach, and waited. The soldiers paused a few yards ahead, talking quietly in German. Helen had learned just enough to catch words like Amerikaner and Frau. Her chest tightened. She had to move. Slowly, deliberately, she inched along the side of the wall, every muscle taut, every nerve screaming. The patrol moved on, and she exhaled silently,
barely daring to think she had survived. Hours later, she reached a makeshift checkpoint set up by Allied forces. Soldiers were busy unloading supplies, their eyes scanning the horizon. Helen's heart leapt as she approached a sergeant she recognized from a previous delivery. He was busy, hands smeared with ink and mud, but he nodded when she handed over a batch of letters. "Another miracle," he muttered. Helen didn't respond, only forced a tight smile and slipped back into the shadows, knowing she couldn't linger. The journey back through the forest was worse than before. The morning fog had thickened, making shadows seem alive. Every snapped twig sounded like an alarm, every distant shout a threat. Helen moved swiftly but cautiously, the satchel's weight dragging against her shoulders. The knowledge of the letter's importance anchoring her resolve. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees. A branch snapped. Helen froze. Somewhere in the fog, a figure appeared. A German soldier, moving cautiously, rifle raised. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She ducked behind a fallen log, satchel pressed to her chest, and prayed for invisibility. The soldier paused, scanning the area, his eyes sharp, his movements deliberate. Helen's stomach knotted. She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears. For what felt like eternity, he stood there, a silent specter, before finally moving on. Helen remained frozen for a moment longer, ensuring he was gone, before continuing. Each step forward was agony, a test of patience and nerves, but she pressed on. By midday, she reached the next village, small and mostly intact. Here she would make the first of several handoffs. She moved quickly to a nondescript house, knocking on the door in a prearranged rhythm. The door opened to reveal a Red Cross volunteer, young but seasoned, who quickly ushered her inside. Helen handed over the satchel, watching as the letters were carefully cataloged and prepared for shipment. "Your timing is impeccable," the volunteer said. Helen only nodded, exhaustion and adrenaline mingling in her expression. She didn't have the energy to respond, didn't have the luxury. Every letter delivered was a temporary victory. Every mile back, another gauntlet to survive. The afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the landscape. Helen knew her journey back would be treacherous. German patrols increased as evening approached, and every step in the dark amplified the danger. She pressed herself against walls, hugged the sides of buildings, and moved silently, like a ghost in a land that had been stripped of life and hope. As night fell, Helen reached a forest path that would take her back to the relative safety of Allied territory. The woods were dark, ominous, and alive with the sounds of the war. Distant gunfire, the rumble of artillery, the faint cries of men and women she could only hope had survived the day. She clutched her satchel tighter, each letter a heartbeat, each life a reminder of the stakes. A sudden rustle to her right made her spin, eyes wide. A pair of figures emerged, German soldiers, moving silently but with purpose. Helen's stomach dropped. She pressed herself against a tree, trying to make herself as small as possible. The soldiers passed within feet, rifles scanning, but she remained unseen. Her chest heaved, tears threatening to spill, but she forced herself to move on, every nerve screaming. Finally, hours later, she emerged from the forest into the open fields near an Allied outpost. Exhausted, battered, and trembling, she handed over the remaining letters to a sergeant who took them without a word, nodding an acknowledgement. Helen sank to the ground, finally allowing herself a brief moment of relief. Each run was a gamble. Every mile, every shadow, every encounter carried the risk of capture, of death, of failure. Yet Helen Carter continued, propelled by something stronger than fear, by purpose, by duty, by the lives of those she carried in her satchel. She lay on the ground, eyes fixed on the night sky,
knowing that tomorrow and the day after she would do it all over again. Each letter delivered was a victory against despair, a defiance of rules, and a testament to the courage of a young woman who refused to be invisible. For Helen, there would be no turning back. The letters were her mission. The danger was her companion. And the hope she carried was her weapon. The dawn was gray and bitter when Helen Carter began her next run. Mud clung to her boots like chains, every step a reminder of how fragile her mission was. 30 letters pressed against her chest in her satchel, each one a life, a story, a soul dangling somewhere between hope and despair. She moved silently, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, eyes scanning every shadow, every shattered wall, every tree that could hide a danger she could not afford to meet. The path ahead was open but treacherous. Shell craters dotted the ground, mud sucked at her boots, and the air was heavy with the tang of smoke and gunpowder. Helen had memorized this route, every bend, every ditch, every ruined building. But memorization did not guarantee survival, not in a land that had been ripped apart by war. A sudden sound, a snapped branch, made her freeze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She pressed herself against the side of a ruined barn, trying to make herself invisible. Across the field, a group of German soldiers emerged, moving deliberately, rifles glinting in the weak light. Helen's stomach dropped. Each second stretched into eternity as she stayed perfectly still. The soldier scanned the area, speaking in harsh, clipped tones. Helen could catch enough words to know they were not unaware of her presence. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but running could be fatal. She waited, still as the earth, holding her breath so long it felt like she might pass out. Minutes crawled by. Then, almost imperceptibly, they moved on, vanishing into the fog. Helen exhaled silently, pressing a hand to her chest to steady her pulse. 30 lives rode in her bag, and she had survived this encounter. She continued on, each step more deliberate, more careful. Every shadow seemed to shift with menace, every whisper of wind a warning. By midday, she reached a small village. Bombed-out walls, shattered windows, blackened streets, the remnants of a city at war. Civilians were scarce, moving quickly, faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Helen slipped through the streets, keeping to the shadows, her satchel secure. She approached a building she had marked the night before, a drop point where letters would be transferred safely. Inside, a volunteer recognized her immediately. "Helen," she whispered, almost reverently, "you shouldn't be out here alone." "I have to," Helen replied, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "They're waiting." The letters were passed quickly, cataloged, stamped, and sent on their way. Each envelope saved was a victory, but Helen's work was far from done. The moment she stepped outside, she was reminded of the dangers that still lurked. The journey back was darker, colder, and lonelier. Fog thickened, reducing visibility to a few feet. Every snapped twig, every distant shout, every shadow could be her end. Helen moved carefully, pressed against walls and trees, heart pounding, nerves taut. Then she saw them, a small group of Allied soldiers ahead, resting after a supply run. She approached cautiously, hoping for guidance, but didn't speak. The letters were heavy, her legs screamed, her mind raced with fear and focus. Every second counted. The soldiers didn't question her. They knew who she was, what she carried. They had heard whispers. Helen handed over a few envelopes for safekeeping, knowing each one delivered was a step closer to hope. She pressed on, the forest looming ahead, darkness swallowing the path. The woods were treacherous, fallen branches, deep mud, hidden craters, all threatened to betray her. Every step required perfect attention. The satchel weighed heavily, pressing against her shoulders and back. Her lungs burned, legs ached, but she could not stop. The letters, the lives within them, demanded she move forward. Suddenly, a rustle to her right made her freeze. 2 German soldiers appeared, rifles raised. Helen's stomach dropped, her hands gripping the satchel. She pressed herself against a tree, holding her breath, heart hammering so loudly it seemed the soldiers could hear it. They paused, scanning the shadows, then moved on. Helen exhaled slowly, relief flooding her body, but she knew this was only one of many dangers she would face. Every run carried the same risk, the same terror, the same chance that it could be her last. Hours later, she emerged near an Allied outpost. Exhausted, covered in mud, trembling from adrenaline, she handed over the remaining letters to a sergeant who accepted them without question, a silent acknowledgement of the risks she had taken. Helen sank to the ground, relief mingling with exhaustion. Each day was a test of endurance, courage, and nerves. Each letter delivered was a triumph against despair. Helen had become more than a volunteer. She was a lifeline, a bearer of hope, a defier of rules, a young woman carrying the weight of dozens of lives on her shoulders. As night fell, she rested briefly on a supply truck, eyes on the stars barely visible through smoke and haze. Tomorrow, she would do it all over again. The danger would increase, the stakes would rise. But Helen Carter had made a vow. She would not break. I will not fail. Not one, not ever. Helen Carter had faced death on countless roads, in countless fields. But nothing in her journey had prepared her for the day the war came home. A letter from Cincinnati arrived, delivered by a trembling courier, stamped with the type of finality that made her stomach twist. Her brother Danny was gone. She collapsed onto the chair in the dimly lit tent, the envelope trembling in her hand. Her hands shook violently as she read the words again and again, unable to fully comprehend. The boy she had laughed with at breakfast, who had argued over baseball scores, who had promised to write her the funniest letter imaginable from the front, was dead. Her knees buckled. The satchel with the letters pressed against her chest felt heavier than ever, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Tears blurred the inked words, smearing the page, but she didn't care. She let herself feel the agony, the rage, the helplessness. Other volunteers tried to comfort her. They whispered, held her hand, offered soft murmurs, but nothing could reach the depth of her grief. The war had stolen something irreplaceable. She had faced bullets, shells, and enemy patrols, but none of that had broken her like this. Helen's mind raced. She thought of the letters she was carrying, the ones she had saved, the ones still in crates, the ones she would deliver tomorrow. The thought that she might be risking her life for them while her own brother lay in a grave crushed her. The bitter irony was almost unbearable. She pressed a hand to her forehead and whispered to herself, I can't stop. I can't fail them, or him. Her grief became fuel. She packed the satchel again, her movements mechanical but determined. Every letter inside represented someone else's pain, and she refused to let them down, even while her own heart was breaking. The roads to France were colder now, the mud deeper, the shadows darker. Helen moved with a precision born of desperation. Each step, each glance, each rustle of leaves carried the weight of life and death. She had become a ghost, invisible yet unstoppable, moving through a world ripped apart by violence. At a small village along the route, she encountered a group of Allied soldiers. They were battered, weary, but grateful for her presence. Helen handed over the letter she carried for delivery, her hands still trembling from grief. The soldiers nodded silently, understanding the courage it took to move through enemy territory with nothing but a satchel of letters and the will to survive. Hours later, she pressed on, the landscape a blur of craters, shattered walls, and twisted metal. Each step was agony, each breath a struggle, but she couldn't stop. She carried the weight of 35 letters, hundreds of others in crates back in England, and now the unbearable knowledge of her brother's death. Night fell, thick and suffocating, as Helen navigated the forest paths back to safety. Every snapped twig, every shadow, every whisper of wind reminded her of the patrols she had evaded countless times before. She pressed herself against a tree, satchel pressed tightly against her chest, and allowed herself a brief, silent morning. Her hands shook as she reached the drop-off point, handing over the letters to a sergeant who accepted them without question. Helen sank to the ground, exhaustion and grief mingling, knowing that tomorrow she would do it all again. The war had taken her brother, but Helen refused to let it take hope. Each letter delivered was a triumph over despair, a defiance of the chaos surrounding her, and a promise to the families awaiting news of their sons. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her tent, heart heavy with grief, yet determined. The letters were her mission, the danger her companion, and the hope she carried, the hope that she would continue to deliver, continue to survive, continue to fight in her own way, was her weapon. Helen whispered to herself, a vow that burned brighter than any fear. For Danny, for them, I will not fail. Not one, not ever. Helen Carter moved through the French countryside like a shadow, silent and unbroken, carrying her satchel of letters with the precision and care of someone transporting the most precious cargo in the world. She had been on countless runs, dodged enemy patrols, and survived situations that would have broken even the strongest soldiers. Yet each journey now carried a weight she hadn't fully felt until this day. The responsibility not just to deliver messages, but to be a lifeline, a symbol of hope. The first light of dawn barely touched the horizon when she left her shelter. The fields were misty, the earth soft and treacherous underfoot, but Helen moved quickly, every sense alert. She had memorized this route, every twist of the road, every broken fence, every barn she could hide behind. Every shadow could be death, every noise a warning. Halfway through her journey, she encountered a group of American soldiers resting after a supply run. They were young, terrified, exhausted, yet when they saw Helen, their eyes lit with recognition. Whispers passed through the group, "It's Helen, she's carrying letters." One young private stepped forward, a letter crumpled in his hand. "Miss Carter, if you can, please deliver this to my mother. She hasn't heard from me in weeks." Helen took the envelope, nodding. "I will, I promise." Her voice was steady, but her chest ached. She had delivered hundreds of letters, yet each one still felt like a life-or-death mission. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. The soldiers watched her vanish into the mist like a ghost, their hope riding on her courage. The forest ahead was darker than usual, the fog clinging to broken trees and shattered remnants of battle. Helen pressed herself close to the side of the path, satchel against her chest, eyes darting for movement. Every snapped branch, every rustle of leaves made her heart pound. The soldier she had avoided yesterday haunted her mind. What if today she wasn't so lucky? A sudden sound, a footstep, made her freeze. Two German soldiers emerged, rifles raised, moving cautiously but deliberately. Helen's pulse thundered in her ears. She ducked behind a fallen tree, holding her breath, every muscle coiled for action. The soldiers paused, scanning the area, and for a terrifying moment, she thought they would spot her. Then, as if fate itself had intervened, they moved on, disappearing into the fog. Helen exhaled slowly, relief flooding through her, but she did not linger. Every second she stayed in the open was a second too many. Hours later, she reached a small village where she would make the first of her handoffs. The streets were silent, buildings scarred from recent bombings. Civilians moved quickly, faces drawn and pale. Helen slipped through the alleys, approaching a Red Cross volunteer she knew. Without words, she handed over the letters, each one carefully catalogued and prepared for shipment. But the work wasn't done. The next leg of her journey was even more dangerous, an open field leading to a heavily patrolled checkpoint. She moved with deliberate precision, every step calculated, every glance measuring distance and cover. The wind carried the faint sound of voices, rifles clinking against shoulders, the unmistakable rhythm of soldiers marching. Helen pressed herself against a ruined wall, satchel clutched tightly, heart hammering. Patrols passed, scanning the horizon, and for the briefest moment she felt as if the entire world had narrowed to her and the letters she carried. One wrong move, one miscalculated step, and it would all be over. The patrol passed, and she continued, moving swiftly through the field, reaching the safety of a small forest on the far side. Each tree was a shield, each shadow a cloak. Helen's breathing was heavy but controlled, exhaustion gaunt at her, but she pushed through. Finally, she reached the drop-off point near an Allied outpost. The sergeant there recognized her immediately, taking the letters without question. Helen collapsed into a nearby crate, hands shaking, satchel empty for now, relief washing over her. Each delivery was a victory, a triumph over the chaos surrounding her, and yet she knew the danger would return tomorrow. Word of her courage had begun to spread. Soldiers whispered of the American woman who carried messages through enemy lines, who risked everything for hope. They trusted her implicitly, knowing she could navigate the most perilous routes, evade detection, and deliver what others thought impossible. Helen Carter had become a legend, but she never allowed herself to feel invincible. Every run was a gamble, every shadow a threat, every moment a choice between life and death. Yet she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that each letter was a heartbeat, each envelope a lifeline. That night, as she rested briefly on a supply truck, Helen allowed herself a moment of reflection. The letters she carried weren't just words, they were hope, love, closure, and courage. Each family waiting for news relied on her. Each soldier she had encountered trusted her. And now, more than ever, she understood that her mission was bigger than herself. Her hand rested on the empty satchel, and she whispered a vow to the darkness. I will not fail, not one, not ever. Helen Carter, alone in a war-torn land, had become the embodiment of courage, defiance, and hope. Every run made her stronger, every letter delivered reinforced her purpose, and every risk she survived etched her name into the memories of those who depended on her. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, she knew she would rise again, carrying letters, carrying hope, carrying the unyielding courage of an American woman who refused to be invisible in a world that desperately needed her. Helen Carter moved before dawn again, the chill biting through her uniform. The countryside lay silent, deceptive in its calm. Each step she took pressed her deeper into the territory that German soldiers still patrolled, a world where one mistake could end everything she had worked for. The satchel pressed against her chest, the letters inside heavier than ever, each one a pulse of hope she could not afford to break. The path was treacherous, mud sucking at her boots, broken branches threatening to betray her. Helen moved with the precision of someone who had done this countless times, yet every encounter reminded her how fragile life was. The mist in the fields blurred shapes, turning harmless debris into looming threats, making her heart pound with every step. Halfway through the morning, she encountered a patrol of Allied soldiers, weary and battered. They had been briefed about her presence, their expressions a mix of awe and relief as she passed them with her letters. A young soldier approached, a crumpled envelope in his hand. "Please, Miss Carter, my mother, she hasn't heard from me in weeks." Helen nodded, taking the envelope carefully. "I'll make sure it reaches her." Her voice was calm, but inside her heart thundered. Each letter was a life, a story, a hope that depended on her courage and carefulness. She could not fail, not now, not ever. The forest ahead was dark and oppressive, branches clawing at her coat, roots threatening to trip her. Every rustle, every distant sound made her freeze. Helen pressed herself against a fallen tree, her breath slow and controlled. In the fog, shapes moved, enemy soldiers, always watching, always waiting for mistakes. A sudden shout broke the silence. Helen dropped flat into the mud, heart hammering, as a group of German soldiers emerged, rifle scanning. She held her breath, clinging to the earth, satchel pressed tightly against her. Seconds felt like hours. Then, by some miracle, they moved on, disappearing into the fog. Helen exhaled, relief washing over her, but she could not linger. Each second spent stationary was a risk. Hours passed as she navigated through the ruined countryside. Fields scarred by shell craters, villages partially destroyed, streets littered with debris. She moved silently, invisibly, carrying the lives of 30 letters, hundreds more waiting in England. Each step a delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. Finally, she reached a village designated for the first handoff of the day. The streets were quiet, windows shattered, smoke rising from partially burned buildings. A Red Cross volunteer recognized her immediately, taking the letters and cataloging them for shipment. Helen watched, her chest heavy, knowing each delivery was only a temporary reprieve. The next leg of her journey, the most dangerous, awaited. The open fields leading to the next checkpoint were exposed and unforgiving. Helen moved deliberately, crouching low, measuring every stride, timing her movements between shadows and debris. Enemy patrols were nearby, their presence felt even before they appeared. Every sound, the wind, the distant gunfire, the creak of a broken fence, could give her away. Helen pressed herself against a fallen tree, her breath slow and controlled. In the fog, shapes moved, enemy soldiers, always watching, always waiting for mistakes. A sudden shout broke the silence. Helen dropped flat into the mud, heart hammering, as a group of German soldiers emerged, rifle scanning. She held her breath, clinging to the earth, satchel pressed tightly against her. Seconds felt like hours. Then, by some miracle, they moved on, disappearing into the fog. Helen exhaled, relief washing over her, but she could not linger. Each second spent stationary was a risk. Hours passed as she navigated through the ruined countryside. Fields scarred by shell craters, villages partially destroyed, streets littered with debris. She moved silently, invisibly, carrying the lives of 30 letters, hundreds more waiting in England. Each step a delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. Finally, she reached a village designated for the first handoff of the day. The streets were quiet, windows shattered, smoke rising from partially burned buildings. A Red Cross volunteer recognized her immediately, taking the letters and cataloging them for shipment. Helen watched, her chest heavy, knowing each delivery was only a temporary reprieve. The next leg of her journey, the most dangerous, awaited. The open fields leading to the next checkpoint were exposed and unforgiving. Helen moved deliberately, crouching low, measuring every stride, timing her movements between shadows and debris. Enemy patrols were nearby, their presence felt even before they appeared.
Every sound, the wind, the distant gunfire, the creak of a broken fence, could give her away. A rustle to her right, Helen froze. 2 German soldiers stepped from the fog, rifles ready. Her pulse spiked. She pressed herself against the ground, satchel protecting the precious cargo, every nerve taut. The soldiers scanned the area, voices sharp in German, and for a terrifying moment she thought she would be caught. Then they moved on, oblivious to her presence. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to keep moving. Hours later, as dusk fell, Helen approached a friendly outpost. The sergeant waiting for her recognized her immediately, taking the letters without question. Helen sank to the ground, exhaustion and adrenaline mingling, her hands shaking. Each delivery was a victory, yet the relief was fleeting. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new patrols, new risks. Word of her courage had spread among soldiers and volunteers alike. Whispers of the American woman carrying messages through enemy lines had turned into admiration and reliance. Soldiers entrusted her with their last words, families depended on her for closure, and Helen became more than a courier, she became a symbol of hope in a world torn by war. That night, as she rested briefly on a supply truck, Helen reflected on the countless runs, the dangers faced, the letters delivered. Each one carried not just words, but life, memory, hope. She understood now that her mission was bigger than survival. It was about sustaining humanity amid chaos. She whispered to herself, a vow stronger than fear, stronger than exhaustion. I will not fail, not one, not ever. Helen Carter, alone yet unbroken, carried the courage of dozens on her shoulders. Every run etched her name into the hearts of those who depended on her. Every letter delivered was a triumph against despair. And with the first light of dawn creeping across the horizon, she knew she would rise again, delivering hope, defying danger, and proving that courage came in many forms, not always with a rifle, but sometimes with pen, paper, and unyielding determination.
Helen Carter stood at the edge of the forest, dawn barely touching the horizon, the chill biting through her coat. Her boots were caked with mud, her body exhausted from weeks of dangerous runs, yet she carried the satchel against her chest as if it weighed nothing at all. Inside were the final batch of letters she had risked her life to save. Letters from soldiers who had laughed, cried, and dreamed of home, each one a heartbeat she had promised to deliver. She paused for a moment, allowing herself to feel the gravity of everything she had endured. Enemy patrols, shell-cratered roads, freezing nights, the near capture, the grief of losing her brother, all of it had brought her to this moment. And yet she could not falter, not now, not when so many depended on her courage. The first checkpoint lay ahead, heavily guarded, a gauntlet she had run before, but never without fear. She pressed herself into the shadows, moving silently, listening to the whispers of the wind and the distant hum of artillery. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves felt like it could give her away. 2 German soldiers emerged suddenly from the fog. Helen froze, heart hammering. Satchel tight against her chest, she crouched behind a ruined wall, willing herself invisible. The soldiers scanned the area, voices sharp and commanding, rifles glinting in the dim light. Helen's pulse raced, each second stretching into eternity. Then, as if fate herself intervened, they turned and moved on, leaving her trembling but unharmed. Hours later, she emerged near a village, the site for her first handoff of the day. Smoke curled from chimneys, buildings scarred from bombardment, streets littered with debris. A Red Cross volunteer recognized her immediately, eyes wide with admiration and relief. Without words, Helen handed over the letters, each one carefully cataloged and prepared for shipment. Her satchel was empty for a fleeting moment, yet the weight of responsibility pressed heavier than ever on her. Each letter delivered was a life saved from the silence of waiting, each envelope a promise fulfilled. She had become more than a volunteer. She had become a lifeline, a symbol, a beacon of hope for soldiers and families alike. The next leg of her journey took her across open fields, exposed and unforgiving. Enemy patrols were known to sweep the area at any moment. Helen moved with deliberate precision, timing her steps between shadows, crouching low, making herself as small as possible. The fog thickened, swallowing her silhouette, but amplifying every sound she made in her mind. Suddenly, a shout broke the silence. 2 German soldiers emerged, rifles trained, eyes sharp. Helen pressed herself flat into the mud, heart racing, satchel pressed against her chest. Every second stretched unbearably long. And then, with unexplainable luck, the soldiers moved on, disappearing into the mist. Helen exhaled slowly, forcing herself to keep moving, aware that danger was never far behind. As dusk approached, she reached an Allied outpost, weary, battered, and trembling. The sergeant recognized her immediately, taking the letters without question, a silent acknowledgement of the peril she had survived to deliver them. Helen pontus to the ground, exhaustion, adrenaline, and relief mingling. Every step, every run, every risk had led to this moment. Word of her courage had spread far and wide among soldiers and volunteers. Helen Carter was no longer just a courier, she was a legend. Soldiers entrusted her with their last words, families relied on her for closure, and everyone who crossed paths with her understood the bravery it took to navigate the treacherous paths between hope and death. That night, Helen rested briefly, staring at the stars visible through the tent flap. She thought of her brother, of the countless soldiers whose letters she had delivered, of the families awaiting news. She whispered to herself, a vow forged in fear, grief, and unwavering courage. I will not fail, not one, not ever. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. She had faced death more than she could count. She had stared into the abyss of enemy territory, dodged bullets, artillery, and patrols, and yet she survived. More importantly, she had delivered hope where there was none, a lifeline in a world ripped apart by war. Helen's story did not end here. Her bravery inspired others, creating a network of volunteers who risked everything to carry letters, messages, and hope across front lines. Soldiers whispered her name in foxholes, mothers in America prayed for her safety, and the legend of Helen Carter, the American woman who smuggled letters through enemy lines, grew with every story told. Her final run of this particular day complete, Helen looked out over the horizon. The battlefield stretched endlessly before her, a landscape of danger, grief, and devastation. Yet she did not hesitate. She had chosen this path, she had accepted the responsibility, and she would continue, carrying letters, carrying hope, carrying courage, until the war ended or she could carry no more. Helen Carter, Red Cross volunteer, smuggler of letters, bearer of hope, had proven that courage came in many forms. Not always with rifles or tanks, but sometimes with a pen, paper, and an unyielding spirit that refused to be broken. And as the first light of a new day touched the land, she rose again, ready to continue her mission, a living testament to bravery, compassion, and the unbreakable human spirit.